but I think that doesn't matter. I'm sitting here with Stephanie Seidel. She is currently working as associate curator at the ICA in Miami. She recently curated not only major solo exhibitions by Judy Chicago, Thomas Bayerle and Diamond Stingley or William Copley, but she also organized an important symposium, They Fail to Remember Us, Expanding Intersectional Feminism, last year in 2019, right? Mm-hmm. And currently she is preparing 2 surveys or more, but like one of the central I want to mention at this point is like by Michel Mayeros and Betty Sau. That's both going to happen, I think, next year? Oh, no, this year. December. Yeah. My name is Anna Goetz. I am working as an independent curator here in Mexico City at the moment. Before I came here, I have worked for many years at the MMK in Frankfurt. And like many contemporary art museums in Europe, but also in the US, its collection is built on art historical discourses developed in the West, such as pop, minimal art, and post-minimal art. During my time working there as a curator, our exhibition and collection program strongly focused on expanding, actually, the collection with narratives and traditions that were developed outside and independently from these Western discourses. And our mission was strongly to kind of involve these discourses in the collection of our museum, or like in the kind of like not to kind of separate the Western discourse and the non-Western discourse, but just talking about a kind of, as far as you can, about a global discourse with different centers and different contexts to grow in and speak from. We organize, for example, large exhibitions with the curator Simon Jami, who is a curator and art historian who is specialized on artistic discourses and traditions in African countries. We also presented major solo exhibitions by Elio Tisika, Santo Mofokeng, Hassan Khan, Kadaratia, Claudia Andujar, amongst others. And right then, when I left, the museum organized a large collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art in Buenos Aires, and the exhibition was called A Tale of Two Worlds. This exhibition aimed for a dialogue between European, North American canon and the Latin American art from the 40s to the 80s. And this exhibition was also part of a kind of like a larger, I think, 5 years initiative by the German Federal Cultural Foundation program, which was called Global Museum Collections of the 20th Century in Global Perspective, that encouraged museums to examine their histories and their collections in order to like redefine the perspective they speak of and redefine, kind of like include, as I said, mentioned before, non-Western narratives. Or perspectives, actually. Perhaps we can get to that later, perhaps in a discussion, because I also, like, I have to say, like, in retrospect, also criticize the strategy we followed back then, because it was strongly kind of defined by a comparative strategy of working. And in addition to this programmatic focus, presenting non-Western artists and discussing them within their context and formal discourse also, we also try to question the boundaries of visual arts by initiating, for example, the choreographer, or inviting the choreographer William Forsythe, or the designer Kostas Morkodis, or the theater director Ersan Montag, to present their work in dialogue with our collection. And we try to invite them to kind of create new understandings of the collection, or the works in the collection, but also more generally to focus on ideas in general and on the diversity of an aesthetic language and a form of expression. And so these projects were also part of a general avocation to understand art as a space for proposing ideas and standpoints, and the museum as a platform for dialogue in which the viewer and his own experience is an active part. So this just as a kind of like a rough like introduction into my background, and perhaps also like as an explanation why I'm interested in talking about today's subject, working with collections. And also to mention, I mean, what we, like our focus at MMK was not a unique one. I mean, there was like internationally, I think in Europe or like in the United States, there brought like initiatives that kind of really tried to redefine their collections, their perspectives. I mean, one like very central one, I think, was an exhibition that was curated by Andrea Giunta and Agustin Perez Rubio at the Malba in 2017 that was called Verbo America. And also like a very prominent and very recent one is the so-called new MoMA, so like a new collection presentation and organization at the MoMA in New York. I invited Steffi not only because of the projects I mentioned before, but mostly because of projects she did before, on the one hand at ICA, but also while she was still working in Germany, because she in both places worked in I think a very inspiring and innovative and playful way with collections and with artists to kind of explore collections and kind of creating them as kind of like a platform and inviting the audience to kind of also learn new things and kind of like open up like fixed concepts of meaning. So what we're going to do is Steffi will present three different projects that have like very different, will follow different strategies and have different focuses. And I might ask questions after each presentation, and after the three presentations we open up and we invite you to ask questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I wanted to start talking about a project that has a very long name. It's called 25 Artists, 25 Museums, 25 Years, which was initiated by the Arts Foundation of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is in Düsseldorf, and which usually funds project, and they celebrated their 25th birthday, so they came up with a project that would not celebrate themselves, but rather celebrate the museums in the region or in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. And Barbara Könches, who initiated the project and created the concept, invited me to be the curator of the project together with her. And what we did was we invited two juries to make a decision which 25 museums would take part first, because actually in that state there are way more than 25 museums that show contemporary art and collect art. It's one of the densest cultural regions in the world, actually. A lot of cities are extremely close by, so I guess that region, most of these 25 cities would probably fit into Mexico City. They're so close by, yet they all have very different backgrounds, and where the city's history, the money came from, for like Essen, it came from steel, others are coal mining, others are again textile. So there's very different histories to all these small cities. And the two juries, the one picked the museums, the other jury invited international artists who are all not from there to take a look at these museum collections and create actually a new work that would raise awareness for each museum's collection. And it came also from the background that all these museums are city-run, so they're initially actually they're public, they're part of the city government. The collections are owned by the city government, so they're maintained by tax money and then technically owned by the citizens. So, and looking at that concept, there's still a lot of the collections are not super visible. You would get funding for big temporary blockbuster shows, but the collection is kind of there, but no one really looks at it so much. So that was the premise for the project, and so you see here I wanted to talk actually about Tercero and Quinto, who just have a project here at the Diego Rivera Museum where we went this morning, and they were invited to the Kunstmuseum Bochum, and the other project is going to be Lena Henke, who is at the Skulpturmuseum Glaskasten in Mahl. So when we invited Seidel and Quinto, we said you can stay up to 3 weeks to come up with an idea for the work, and the foundation, so basically me, would take care of the production of the work and communicate with the local curators in the local museum. And in Bochum, Seidel and Quinto said, we come from Mexico, so it's kind of far. We want to come for 3 weeks and live in Bochum and figure out what we want to do, because their approach is very conceptual and it's very site-specific. And so they spent 3 weeks in Bochum, and we kept checking, and it's like, what are you coming up with? Like, what do you think you're going to do? And eventually, as the deadline approached, they were like, we have something. And it's called Vendedor de Flores, the flower seller. So spending the days in the city, wandering around, thinking of the role of the museum within the city, they realized, well, if the collection is owned by the city, it's owned by the citizens, by anybody who pays taxes in Bochum, so why don't we make this gesture of reintroducing one person who lives in Bochum to the collection. So they circled in on a man they saw every night who would go from bar to bar, restaurant to restaurant, selling flowers. And they asked him if he was interested to come to the museum twice a week, and the museum would buy his flowers that you see at the front desk there. And in exchange, twice a week they would put out a work from their collection, and the curators would talk about the work to that flower seller and kind of have him like the model citizen to look at the pieces. So here you see twice a week they would exchange the work, and what the curators at the museum told me, that was also a great opportunity for them actually to go back into the collection and discover what they hadn't thought about for a long time, but maybe needed to be reframed. And there you see him and the curator talking about the work. And so they actually kept it running for a couple of months, and part of each of these 25 projects was also that there was a billboard. So often these museums, well, sometimes they're in the city center, but often they're also more in the periphery. So it was really also raising visual awareness, and we ask every artist on top of their project to come up with a billboard idea that we would put in the main station, really like make clear that this collection is theirs and they should go and attend to the museum. So yeah, why not? So the second project, yes?
Ask a question. Who selected the piece that, you said like every week there was a new work? Who selected that work? Was it in collaboration with the Seidel and Quinto, or with the flower seller, or?
So that was actually up to the museum, and that was also an interesting project because it started with a curator who worked directly with Seidel and Quinto, but then it actually, because it was twice a week actually, so it was a lot of works, it expanded throughout the team. So they invited other members of the team to look into the collection as well and select something they would like. So it was actually also interesting behind the scenes in the museum, where it was more of like a community idea and like also giving more people at the museum access.
And was it also that the person who selected the work was kind of presenting the work, or like that? Because you said like the way you describe it, it sounds like it's a very kind of subjective selection also, that the person who selected was like, that's a work I haven't seen for a long time, or that's like my favorite work, or like, I don't know, it could be like very different reasons obviously, and I assume that it doesn't necessarily have to do with the other like collection presentation or like temporary exhibitions in the museum. So I guess that's like it's also like a very interesting kind of approach to like decontextualized, choose one work for this moment.
Yeah, definitely, and I don't remember exactly now, but I think at this time the museum actually didn't have any of their collection on display, or just very little, and they would focus on temporary exhibitions, and they built this wall in the lobby of the museum just to present that painting. So there actually was no wall before then, and they built a new wall to put this up and show very different range. I remember one was František Kupka, so like 20s, but then more contemporary, So really a mix that was not really related to the temporary exhibitions.
And were there like visitors that like always came, kind of like got it also kind of like event that like people knew, that's like there's like there's going to be a new work revealed, and we're like, or like how did it work with the audience also? I mean,
it was interesting because what easily happens and what Tercero and Quinto were very adamant about not to happen was to kind of turn this flower seller into like a star, or really like personalize it to him, because then it's a great idea, but for them it was really also the point, as you see in the billboards, that you only see him from the back, you don't see his face, and that was really important to them, so it remains replaceable in a way. It could be anybody living in the city looking at the work. But then on the other hand, you get these local newspapers like want to do reporters like, who's a flower seller? Like, where did he come from? What is his history? Which was not the point. The point was for it to remain anonymous, but then just give this awareness rather to the work. But it's also, I feel people always want to relate to people. So.
And I guess it's also with the flowers, it's also, I guess it's kind of like creating this celebratory moment of kind of like every time, like every week another kind of like opening, let's say, like celebrate it also, like really this moment of presenting a new work.
Right. But it was also important for Tercero and Quinto, for the flower seller to not just spend his time, which would like keep him from selling flowers in the restaurants. So they would, as a gesture, say like, okay, you spend 20 minutes at the museum, and in exchange we buy 20 flowers that you would otherwise probably spend longer trying to sell.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to dive into one other project of the 25, which is by German sculptor Lena Henke, which was called Yes, I'm Pregnant. And it was actually the first of the 25 project. It's at a small museum in Mal, which is kind of middle of nowhere, former coal mining region. And the city of Mal has a super interesting history. Actually, 2 years ago, the sculpture project in Münster partnered with Mal, because the city of Mal was actually the first one in Germany in the 60s who introduced the idea of art in public space. They had at that time a lot of money from coal mining and chemical industry, and they basically invited the most famous architects to build the city of the future, and really strongly believed in that art will play an important role in that. So that's how they started collecting. And for instance, I think the local high school is built by Alva Aalto. Their local mall has like the first ever plastic cushion roof. So it's super avant-garde, but then while they were building, the coal mines closed and they ran out of money. So it's this, they have this pool that has like Olympic size, but they can't maintain it anymore, so it's closed. And when Lena Henke first came to visit, she looked at the collection, which has all the classics. So here in this picture, you see the Wood of Belling. I think there's a little Matisse and the Man Ray. When she first came, she realized there's always kids hanging out in the city with nothing to do really, because also before they could really get the proper train connection to the next bigger city, they ran out of money, so there's like a bus 2 times a day. So all these teenagers just hang out, don't really know what to do. And on the other hand, there's this wonderful sculpture collection that is really heavy on male sculptures. And what Lena Henke often does in her work is like create a very personal approach that also puts into focus her being a female sculptor in this like really male-dominated realm, and being obviously much younger. And so she had the idea of doing her own photo love story, like speaking to the teenagers in the city. So Yes, I'm Pregnant is based on the story of a girl who gets pregnant by her boyfriend. She's 16, she's in high school, and she like tries to tell her parents, like the usual thing. It's this whole drama. And the girl is actually embodied by a sculpture by Marino Marini that the museum allowed us to take out of storage and actually place throughout the city in different settings. So, and then you can see Paul is the boyfriend, which is his horse sculpture that we also placed in the back is actually this Olympic swimming pool that's half derelict. Henry Moore is a dad, and there's a mom. So they're trying to figure all these stories out. And it was, I think it was great that the museum allowed us to do, and I think it helped that a lot of these works are very historical and the artists are no longer alive. But it was also this like very subjective gesture of just like taking these pieces and putting them into her own narrative and like imbuing them with like very different meaning, which is not related to the works at all, but really like creating another layer across this. And so we showed in the end this, what the museum got for their collection was the whole photo love story, and we showed it along with all the protagonists of the comic. There's a mom. And then it featured a photo of the museum and the girl on posters throughout the city.
I really like that project also because it's a very provocative project, because it's like on the one hand all these like sculptures, these like heavy sculptures like inscribed in like art history with their individual meaning, and Lena just takes them and like uses them as characters on their own. And I'm not sure if you said like she completely like freed them from any characteristics or that are kind of like related to the artist or the sculpture, or just used it as figures. Also, it's totally gender neutral. It's like it doesn't matter, or like not even like even a horse is a what is a horse? Is a boyfriend. And I was wondering, did you get like how was it received also in the city? And I imagine like with the board, for example, of the museum, that are like very proud of their collection and of their like art historical value also. How did they react to it? Or like how was that conversation?
I think so, because it's a public museum, there's no board, but what we encountered was the director of the museum and the curator and their small team is that actually, because they're part of the city budget and because it's a city that's really struggling, the question comes up is like, why do we have to give you money? Like, what is this about? Like, the collection just eats money, and why do we have to keep financing that? So for him, it was actually very important for an artist to come. Well, Lena's based in New York, so an artist from New York came and worked with a collection and kept saying like, these are amazing things, like this is so great and this has to be visible, and that really helped them also, with also the foundation saying like, this is important. And for like us to come in and like invite the mayor to look at this exhibition. So I think that was really an important statement, where the message was that you should be proud of this and not just look at it in terms of finances. And because in the end, you being a city museum, you compete against high schools and like who's going to renovate the like gym and the swimming pool, and why do we have to give money to the museum? And it should be essential. But I think we really wanted to put emphasis on that.
But I was wondering, it's just like out of my very personal interest also, because also working in museums, it's kind of like also developing ideas for kind of working or like using works for different ideas or for propositions. So I always wonder, like I was always a little bit afraid of kind of taking them out of their historical argument, let's say, and using it for something else. And I was always like afraid, like within the MMK or like other museums, to kind of like have this confrontation that someone comes to me and says like, a young lady, how do you dare to like deconstruct that importance of the Man Ray sculpture, for example.
Right. And I think it was super bold. And then on top of the title of Yes, I'm Pregnant, where I feel everyone is always like, when you mentioned the title, I was like, what are you talking about? It was like this other taboo of like also being a female artist and being like, I'm pregnant, but it's like, it's not, I think there's like many other layers of being a female artist. Like, can you, like, I remember our conversations back then was like, I think Lena was reading the Anne Truitt diaries, who's saying like, I can either be a mother or an artist, but I can't be both, and like also addressing this further taboos. But then I think it's also like very lovingly, and also was helped by the fact that a lot of this was actually in storage, and the museum did not have the staff to really pull it out and work with it actively. So just pulling it out and showing what is there, and I know that the museum, while we were doing that and afterwards, did way more collection exhibitions.
Yeah, I guess it's also perhaps like indirectly like a way of, I could imagine like in education programs, and if someone gets like a tour about the exhibition or like the photo love story, and like then it's like the description of the horse being the boyfriend, and obviously there's kind of like an irritation there. So also I guess the question like, but what is this horse actually? I mean, apart from being the boyfriend, what is it? I mean, where does it come from? What is the context of that work? And I think that's also interesting as a kind of a starting point for like through this irritation, creating a dialogue about the work and its original kind of context, let's say, where it comes from.
Yeah, totally. And I haven't even mentioned the gynecologist in this story is a crazy hand sculpture. It's a huge hand that's half men that's on the, like, how do you call it, the square in front of the high school. So it was like, who puts that there and why? But yeah, there's still a lot of these sculptures throughout the city, and yeah, the idea of like, what does it do in public space?
But the constellations were always temporary for the photo shoot, so to say.
So yeah, there were moving sculptures like the Marini and the horse that were usually kept inside, but then there's still a lot of works that are in the city outside. So this Henry Moore is permanently installed in front of the museum. And then you see on the upper left that kind of cubes and volumes are also permanently installed.
But the new constellations, they didn't stay for a certain time. I mean, like for example, the image of the boy, like the person and the horse, and it was not there for like a certain time.
No,
it was
just
for the footage. Okay.
For the photo. Okay, and so last example that I wanted to show is something completely different, which is Edward and Nancy Kienholz at the Institute of Contemporary Art, which was the first collection show that I curated in the new building that we opened in 2017. So as a background, ICA Miami is a very young institution that was founded 5 years ago, and accordingly the collection is fairly small. And still growing, but not necessarily encyclopedic. So what we started doing as an idea was to pick individual works from the collection and give them one gallery space and add more loans from the same artist from a similar period or relating to a similar topic around this work to give it more context. And I started with this work called The Soup Course at the Shishi Cafe from 1982, which is this weird scene of this, I assume, married couple eating their soup, and the woman has this napkin on her head and can't see, while the man actually focuses his eyes on the young woman on the single table. So as I found out, working with that piece, it's part of a series that's called The Kienholz Women, and that focuses on different roles of women, different roles women take up in society. So there's like the widow, and there's like the pregnant woman who has an abortion, there's like prostitutes. So it's like all very explicit, and when I try to find out more about this work, it turns out that it's probably part of the series. here's some more details. And the series was first shown in 1981. So as a background, Edward Kienholz, West Coast Assemblage, kind of really macho LA artist, Ferris Gallery. But in later in his life, his fifth wife, Nancy Kienholz, started working with him as an artist. And she actually started working with him in 1972 when they first met. However, only in 1981, when the series of the Kienholz woman was first exhibited, he credited her, and he made a statement and said, by the way, I've been working for 9 years with Nancy Kienholz, and I want to give her credit, and she actually co-authored all the works from the past 9 years, and that was an occasion of these Kienholz women. So for me, focusing really detailed on this kind of work was also interesting to learn more about the artist and kind of even maybe try and give more feminist reading to Kienholz, even though it might feel a little bit like a stretch at some point. But then also commissioning new scholarship. We usually do publications and actually ask younger academics, in this case Julie Carson from UC Irvine, to create new writing, and she actually did a way more psychoanalytical reading of Kienholz and the relation to women. So that's kind of the very other end to what I just talked about with Lena and Tercero and Quinto, which is way more academic and scholarly and really just trying to create this like very focused zooms on art history, and then maybe trying to rewrite it in a very like micro level.
How did you, like in that case, you were mentioning different kind of narratives you wanted to kind of point out with this presentation. How did you, articulate these ideas? Like with, like, I don't know, public programming, or like what kind of like formats were there, like kind of surrounding the actual installation to talk about the history of that installation and the importance also to like present it again now and also within a context?
I think that was very subtle in a way. We did not do much programming around it, but it's really just the research that then ends up in a publication is the one thing. But then I think also picking works that are not necessarily super trendy, but then putting them actually in the first gallery. You walk in and kind of be like, hey, this is still around. Like, probably we haven't looked at it in a long time, but maybe we can actually see new aspects in it or find other like relevances. And it can be like, it's very flexible. I did a show also for Louise Bourgeois, which is one work in the collection, and that was a very different approach, where it turned out the sculpture that we have was made from a pink fur coat, and it turns out she made 6 others from the same fur coat, and I managed to get 4 more back together. So it's kind of on a very different idea, but kind of also showing the seriality. Or was that one really showing how artists work, that she would really pick clothes from her wardrobe and then just use it up and make as many as she could. So it's really very small aspects that maybe shed a tiny bit of a different light on an artist.
How is it for your experience, like working in Germany and in the US with collections in museums? What is the expectations from the public? Because you were mentioning like before, like in particular, I think, I mean, I can't talk about the US because I don't have any experience working in the US, but just also for me having the experience working in Germany, I know that the people who live in a city, they like identify with the collection, they are proud of their collection, so they bring all their visitors to their museum and show what great art they have in their museum. So how is it working as a curator in the German museum to like different, or kind of how is it different to like working in the US in a museum with a collection in terms of like an audience of like with the expectations but also, I mean, different modalities, or like, I don't know.
I mean, it's very different just in terms of funding and the whole organizational structure, but I think for me personally the difference is when working with 25 museums, a lot of their collections come from the 50s and 60s when all these regions were really flourishing and there was just a lot of cash around and a lot of collectors. And the cities just had the budget to acquire, whereas at the point where we worked with them, only the really big institutions have the possibility to still buy, and the smaller ones usually really just are thrown back into working with what they have. And so the difference for me being in Miami is really that it's, as I said, extremely young, so we're still growing, and it's kind of, I feel like I just look from the other end where we try to create a collection that will eventually, maybe 20 or 30 years down the road, give a very specific portrait of the city and the community, and also, of course, of the people working at the museum and the people supporting the museum, and just mirror a very specific interest. And that was, yeah, it's kind of, it almost feels like Back to the Future, because being in Germany and looking at collections that are from the 50s and 60s, you could sometimes in specific museums really tell there was this one person that was really interested. For instance, in Neuss, there was this woman who never married, which was crazy in the 50s, like super Catholic Germany. She was never married, and she had this obsession with symbolism, like Odilon Rodin. No one would buy it back in the days. Like everyone was like, oh, please don't. And so this museum has an amazing collection of symbolism, which is completely random, but also really beautiful. And I think just knowing what it would feel like looking back 40, 50, 60 years and seeing like, oh wow, this was really specific and gives like a very specific idea also to the community surrounding it. That's kind of exciting to be working with collections now and acquiring and being like, maybe someone looks at this 40 years down the road and it gives a certain clue about a certain moment.
And just again about the identification, how is it from your experience, like working in Miami with the audience you have? Is there like an identification with a collection, or like how does that work? Or with the program? I mean, yeah.
I think that's something that would be, ideally we would build that, because as being in such a young institution, there's not yet this sense of ownership, which would be great to create. And I say it's free of charge, so anybody can come as often as they want and spend as much time as they want. So it would be nice to create this sense of ownership. And I didn't think about collections that way before working on this 25-25 project, but actually now I see myself rather going to the permanent collection and also expecting to encounter certain works that I feel like I want to see and they should be there for me to look at, which is nice.
And how is it for you in terms of like not only working with collections but also like building a collection in terms of your like geographical, let's say, position? I mean, like in the US, but like very strongly like to the Caribbean, to Latin America, to like how is it on the one hand to what you said, like it's on the one hand also some sort of a portrait of a time, but also, I mean, as I know, like Judy Chicago, for example, she's not only contemporary artist, but she's also, I mean, she's kind of like part of also looking back to a certain career of the last 40 years?
60.
60, okay. 60 years. Yeah, so what is the relation on the one hand, like in terms of your geographical position, but also historically?
I think, well, we really have to pick our battles, and we won't ever have an encyclopedic collection of 60s and 70s feminism as much as I would like to. But I think it's important to, of course, we're an American museum and the majority of our items are American artists, but also obviously following all these recent discussions about like diversifying your collection, including more women, including more artists of color, we really also set goals in trying to acquire not just, I don't know, New York painters, but really to have a focus on like what can be interesting, and then of course also artists who live in Miami and work in Miami, because we are a museum in Miami, and that should be reflected in the collection as well.
Yeah, and I guess also also collecting historical artists is also kind of mirrors at our time now, because it's particular artists for a certain reason why they now get like included in collections or kind of like introduced in a discourse that a museum holds. Yeah.
And I feel there's very different approaches of acquiring, because, for instance, there's this avant-garde museum in Mönchengladbach that probably not many people have heard of, but they bought conceptual art in the 60s and 70s when the conceptual artists were just young dudes working away. They had a gallery in Düsseldorf, and they were just like, I guess that's what we can afford, so we just buy that. And now they have this amazing encyclopedic collection, conceptual art. And then on the other hand, like the state collection of North Rhine-Westphalia, they only started buying in the 60s, and because it was a state, they had a huge budget, so they actually gave the director whatever he wanted, and he just went and picked like the Picasso, the Max Ernst, the Oskar Schlemmer, just because he basically only bought what art history had already proven was important. So it's a very different collection, and those are actually part of what you mentioned of the Global Museum Initiative that now go back and it's like, okay, maybe modernism is not this like linear progressive narrative, and we have to branch out and look at other narratives. But that's a narrative he created with that collection. And it's not so much like other collections that kind of you buy and at some point 20, 30 years later you maybe can see like what was the line that we were following, or was it successful?
Perhaps I would open at this point to the audience if someone has a question. Or not.
So something I find interesting that this conversation brings up is this whole idea of art in public spaces, and there's this idea of collections being an archive that we go back and fill in or bring forward. So there's this interesting thing of how do we keep collections alive, and what part of it are we keeping alive? Are we trying to push something like new acquisitions more? Are we trying to bring up and fill in a gap? So I found these projects very interesting. But it's a particular case. How do we bring collections alive more, I guess, consistently and make it more of like a living archive? I'm wondering maybe if a virtual platform is a great form for that, or just, again, bringing into exhibitions, like having a space in a museum that is focused on bringing collections and having that as the known collection space, and then maybe creating this sense of ownership. So many things, but I guess just the main question would be, how should we keep collections alive, or what your opinion is about that, either of you or both of you?
I feel working with collection, or I feel you almost have to accept that it will never be completely relevant, which is kind of the beauty and the fun of it. There will be parts of the collection that 1 year or like at one certain period are amazing and super important, and then you will move on and go back to something else, which is like also what the Guggenheim just did with artistic license, where they really dug through the archives and found works that no one had really looked at, but others were maybe like classics. But I think that there's this dynamic and that will always keep shifting, so I feel only so many works in a collection can be activated at a time, but that might change. I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's more like a romantic idea maybe, but
yeah.
It's kind of like, for me, it's like two different things. On the one hand, I find it, for example, interesting what the MoMA also recently did in like opening their archive like online, like that you can like look, okay, this work, see like, okay, this is like from, it was like acquired at that point, it was in these exhibitions, in this constellation presented. So because for me, works always kind of speak not only on their own, but also in the constellation they're presented. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's interesting for me to kind of follow up, like what, like the curators in the past, like put these works in which constellations to talk about what, and what was the role of that work within that conversation or proposition that was made. So also for me, in like working with constellations, works from collections in the museum, I'm quite interested in like kind of provocative dialogues also, because to kind of like find out like provocative also, why is it something provocative? Because there is a certain expectation, so it's a certain history that is inscribed in a work or taught through art history, but also, I mean, because on the one hand, of course, every work speaks of its time on the one hand, but on the other hand, takes a stance within the context that is presented. So I think it's this kind of dynamics of like in two directions that interests me a lot. But I think for me it's like still always the question of like just like how much do we as curators, institutions, whoever, have to share, like how do we kind of talk about the history or like of individual work, but also of the constellations you create? How much information do we give? Do we, like with wall texts or leaflets or I don't know, like this is kind of still a question. I think there's no solution to it. I think it's something that is kind of can be done in very different ways and be successful or not. I think it's a question of like trial and error.
I guess it's more of a technical question, but what's the status of the collected objects in Germany versus in America? I know in France, for example, once it gets in the public collection, it's unsellable, so it will be in the public collections forever. And when, apparently in MoMA and in America, the management of collection is also a big part of collecting. Some institutions sell works, decide to focus more on a certain thing. How is it in Germany, and how is it to work in America versus Germany in relation to this sellability of the collected work, if that makes sense?
I mean, as I said, but the United States, I can't say that you have to talk about that. But I think it's, I mean, I would say like, perhaps like generally, there is like a very strong tendency towards giving the objects in the collection more value, no, not value, but kind of more visibility again. And I mean, also with like, from my experience, like working in museums in Germany, it's kind of like, it was like on the one hand, it's kind of like part of a like decolonial discourse also, and also kind of like deconstructing, kind of like question also the role of the museum, not only of like making temporary exhibitions and the collections just in the back room, and it's kind of like a list you have, I don't know, online, or I don't know, but it's like really like using it and kind of like understanding it as a kind of like a precious box of voices and ideas and expressions. So I think it's really like, I think it changes a lot. I would say, like, I don't know, like in the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years, it changed a lot about the kind of the recognition of working with museum objects again, or collection objects.
So your question was also in terms of if you can sell works?
Yeah, in relation to how the collection is managed and looked at by the institution. Like in France, like once it gets in the collection, it stays in the collection forever, so it can get stored forever and nobody will ever see again that thing. While it's not so much seen as maybe an asset or something, while it seems there's a tendency in certain museums in the USA to actually consider past historical work as an asset that you can actually trade, get different works, change your collection focus and these kind of things. And having worked in both, maybe in more European landscape and American landscape, do you feel this change as well as a curator while working with the collection, or not really?
I mean, again, I feel for me it's difficult to make a very general assumption, because I feel the situation at ICA is so specific because it's so young. But I mean, you read a lot about these cases in like Art Forum where a museum is like, well, if we sold our Monet, we could really renovate the building. And I mean, it happens. I don't know how popular that is, but on the other hand, of just this case comes to mind where actually a casino in Aachen sold their triple Elvis Presley by Warhol that the casino back then had basically acquired as wall decor, and 50 years later they realized this is worth millions of dollars and we'd rather have the money. And I think it was sold to a private collector, but there was this huge outcry because it's been there for so long that it should actually go to a museum and stay in the region. But because it had nothing to do with like public money, it did not happen. But then on the other hand, I think of cases in Germany where there are museums that have huge collections of art that is highly unpopular, and they still have to work with it. I think there's also storages full of art that when you have like this idea of like, well, we buy a work from every artist working in the state in order to support them, which was a model in the 70s, but then you're faced with all these works with maybe, I don't know how many percent of these artists are no longer artists and did not have a career, but it's still an artwork you have to store and take care of. So, but I think that's still also similar to France, like really a no-go area. But I mean, that would be interesting and challenging to really look at these works more as well.
Perhaps one, like in case there is another question, yeah? Last question, because we got the sign of the time.
And you mentioned you've been working in Mexico, right? So have you found any difficulties, any challenges working here compared to Europe?
I mean, my position is different. I mean, first of all, because in Germany I worked in institutions, and here I work independent. So, I mean, here I don't have the experience of working myself with collections, for example, or like in museums. But I think it's also, that would be perhaps lead too far, but I think also the collecting practice in Mexico is very different to the United States or like or Germany. I think it's very, very different. But I mean, I don't know, to your question, do you mean like in terms of?
I mean, if it's more difficult to work in Mexico, I mean, there's more bureaucratic things, problems. I mean, compared to Germany, I guess it's quite different.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I mean, I only organized here like independent shows. Or like I curated now the one section here at the Z ONAMACO. I did like another, like every year now, like I did like an independent project, but which was never like incorporated within institutional structure. So, I mean, I know about bureaucracy here, but not from my own working experience. So then, thank you very much.